And so now what we have tonight is we almost finished Deuteronomy last week. So I have just a couple of items, little items left, not little in importance, but small in quantity. And then Deepak is going to take over and take us through the book of Joshua. So just let me remind you from last week regarding Deuteronomy. The name means second law. It's not a new or second set of laws, but an explanation of the earlier covenantal material that they received at Sinai. And Deuteronomy consists mainly of Moses's final sermons. Before we start, though, we should pray. Let me pray. Gracious Father, we just lift up this evening to you and lift up your word and ask that you would use it. You would use your word in our lives. Help us, Father, to pay attention and to key in to what was very important to these biblical authors and therefore to you, and help us to be faithful doers and not forgetful hearers. And we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. So Deuteronomy consists mainly of Moses's final sermons to the children of Israel when they were camped on the plains of Moab before they crossed the Jordan. And Moses delivered and wrote these final messages around 1406 BC at the end of Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, just before his death and Israel's conquest of the promised land west of the Jordan River. And this collection of Moses's messages provided Israel with a constitution for governing their lives in relation to God and his world within the promised land. Now, as you read through the book of Deuteronomy, there's 6 things that becomes very obvious that Moses was intent on getting across in this book and these sets of messages that he put together. First of all, he provided a constitution for guiding Israel's relationship with God. Secondly, he stressed the importance of taking God and his word seriously, which they didn't take that seriously in their subsequent history. Thirdly, he emphasized the centrality of love in one's relationship with God. Fourthly, he detailed the perils of sin and the pleasures of surrender and the promise of grace. That was quite a big point. And then tonight, we're going to finish the last 2. He defined the goal of love, that is, of Israel's love. He defined the goal of love as God-exalting influence on the nations, and he affirmed the supremacy of Yahweh God overall. Okay, so this 5th key point, the author of Deuteronomy defined the goal of love as God-exalting influence on the nations. Deuteronomy portrays the goal of God's love as God-exalting witness in the world. And this is certainly in keeping with the mission Yahweh charged him with at Sinai. We saw that in Exodus. Let me just read that again to you. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. I'm in Deuteronomy. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. He said, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So the treasured possession obviously speaks to the relationship between Israel and Yahweh. But he also says, "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." That kingdom of priests emphasizes their mission. They were representing God to the world. Um, and so Deuteronomy portrays in line with this mission that God gave them in Exodus 19 at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses portrayed the goal of Israel's love as a God exalting witness in the world. Now, Deuteronomy expressed this goal, a God exalting witness, by blending a call to covenant love with the unique treasure of God's presence and the necessity of a worldwide influence for the glory of God. Because the world was in darkness, was it not? And God chose Israel to be his witness amongst the nations. Now, the most explicit text for this we see is in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. And Moses in that passage writes, "See, I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of them. Keep them and do them." So he's calling them here in this first verse and a half. He's calling them to heed Yahweh's commands. And then he goes on to say, "For that the keeping of Yahweh's commands, that will be your." Now notice how this is supposed to be a witness to the rest of the world. "For that, the keeping of Yahweh's commands, that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes," and the peoples, he's referring to the nations around them, "who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today?" So Moses clarified the reason why obedience was imperative. And that reason was a godly witness to the world. Do you see that? And so Israel's love of God demonstrated in their obedience to him was to be a God exalting witness in the world. It's the same thing for us in the church, God's people. And then, so Israel's obedience of faith would result in the display of God's greatness in the sight of the world. Okay, any questions about that? Any comments? Remember, Jesus told us in John 13, around verses 34 and 35, that our love for one another was to be our display of God's greatness in the sight of the world. He said, we will be known, we should be known and will be known by our love for one another. Okay. So, and then finally, the author of Deuteronomy affirmed the supremacy of Yahweh God over all. That comes out so clearly from start to finish in the book of Deuteronomy, that Moses was concerned to affirm the supremacy of Yahweh God over all. So the governing truth at the very core of Israel's worldview was Yahweh's supremacy over all things. Somebody want to get those, two or three of you want to get those verses? I can get the Deuteronomy 4 since I'm already there.
Okay, I'll do Deuteronomy 6:4, or yeah.
Okay, let me get to Deuteronomy, to verse 35 of Deuteronomy 4. Okay. Moses says, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. God showed that to Israel. To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. 6:4, you got it there, Nick?
Yep. Yeah. Now this is the commandment. Oh, wait, hold on. Wait. Okay. Yeah. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Yeah.
Then, and did anyone else? I don't know.
I think
Anyone had?
Deepak's got 33:26.
Okay.
There's none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty.
Yes, I love that passage. We're going to return to that passage at the end here. So, as DeRochi puts it, and obviously he gets this from Piper. They work together. Missions exists because a global recognition of this fact needs to be rekindled. What he's saying is missions exists because the rest of the world needs to recognize the supremacy of Yahweh God over all. See, and that's what Israel's witness was to be to the world, the greatness of Yahweh. And that mission existed because the nations did not view Yahweh as supreme overall. Okay, so not only was that a truth at the very center of Israel's worldview, but also Yahweh alone is Israel's father. Because he is God. Well, look at verse 30, chapter 32, verse 6. You got that, Deepak?
Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you?
Clearly, that father relationship demonstrates his supremacy overall, and he's father of Israel because he created them. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 24. Well, because he is God, he is jealous for his people's love. Because he created them, he's their father. Because he is their God and their father, he is jealous for his people's love. Listen to Deuteronomy 4:24. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Nick, you got 5:9 there?
Yep. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Man.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Deepak's got those two verses in chapter 32.
Right. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. Then 21. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I'll provoke them to anger with the foolish nation.
Yes. Okay. So clearly, because he is God, he is jealous for his people's love and deserves their life encompassing, community embracing, exclusive commitment. Remember, we went through that last week when we went through Deuteronomy 6. Somebody want to read verses 4 and 5 of chapter 6? I'm going to grab the 33.
Like,
Yes.
which chapter 6, verses 4 and 5?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, okay. I just read this. Okay. Hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. I'm gonna continue.
End at verse 5.
Okay, okay. Yep, that's it.
Okay. All right.
I
So
wanted to go to it's verse 6.
yeah, it's so it's very clear. Moses's concern throughout Deuteronomy is to affirm the supremacy of Yahweh God overall. It was at the very heart of their worldview. It was at the very heart of their relationship with him as father. And I love the way I love the way that Moses closes out chapter 33. Yahweh alone can satisfy the hearts of his people. That's another aspect of his supremacy because he is supreme over all. He is the only one who can satisfy the hearts of his people um, fully and eternally. Listen, I'm going to read verse 26 and 29 in Deuteronomy 33. I love this whole passage, 26 through 29, but I'm going to just read the bookend verses there. There is none like God, O Jeshurun. Jeshurun was another name for Israel. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. Then drop down verse 29. Happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph? Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their backs. God's people are a happy people because he alone satisfies the hearts of his people. So that's Deuteronomy. And just to summarize here, Deuteronomy is all about pursuing a lasting covenant relationship with God. Moses treated the book as a charter or constitution for guiding life in relation to Yahweh. And within the pages of this charter or constitution or book, he detailed the relationships context. That is taking God and his word seriously, and the relationship's essence, which is the centrality of love, and the relationship's foundation and means of perpetuation, grace. He's the one that started the relationship graciously, and it's his work in them that will perpetuate it. And it's his future grace in future generations that will perpetuate it. So the foundation and means of perpetuation is grace. And he detailed the relationship's purpose, which is a God exalting influence on the nations around us, around Israel. And he detailed the relationship's Lord, who is Yahweh God himself. Okay. That's Deuteronomy. And so what we're going to do is any questions on Deuteronomy? Why don't we wait? Before we go to Joshua, are there any pressing questions on Deuteronomy from last week or this week? And then Deepak will take us through Joshua. Okay, and take it away,
All right.
Deepak.
You might have to go on.
I will.
All right, now that shouldn't happen.
So, oops, what did I do?
I'll just click that.
So do I just quit Word?
Okay, yeah, you're not sharing it. All right, so you should be able to see my screen. All right, so we're gonna start Joshua now. So with the end of Deuteronomy, we finished the law section of Jesus's Bible. So before I get into Joshua, I want to go back to our first class, kind of just to see where we're at. So in our first class, we talked about how you use this acronym Kingdom to talk about the different sections of the Old Testament. So far we finished K, I, and N. Those were covered in the first 5 books. And then now Joshua is going to start the fourth one, G, government in the promised land. And it's going to cover Joshua, Judges. We're going to skip Ruth, and then Samuel and Kings. So those 4 books will all cover this fourth section here. All right, and then so the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible is that, so we finished the law, and now we're moving on to the prophets. And Joshua the Kings is actually called the former prophets. So here. So if we finish the law, so far, we finished the first 5 books, and then this new section is called the prophets. And within that, we have 2 subsections, the former prophets, which is the narrative books, and the latter prophets, which is speeches and visions. And here, what our Christian Bible calls it, like the historical books. We have Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And
Can I make one comment before you leave?
yes,
So Deepak said we're gonna skip Ruth. And at the bottom, the writings, the former writings, that tells you why. Because in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, Ruth was a preface to Psalms. For a couple reasons that we'll cover when we get to it. But that's why it's not covered in the former prophets.
all right. And one other thing about just the narrative books is that this history, scholars call it the Deuteronomistic history, meaning that what we saw at the end of Deuteronomy, where God gives the kind of his covenant blessings, covenant curses, and the restoration. The history, we're supposed to see the history in light of those covenant promises from Deuteronomy. So the historical books are written so that if God's blessing them, it's because of that they lived up to the covenant promises. And when they're not living up to it, you'll see the curses being fulfilled. And we're going to see that through the 4 books. All right, so Joshua. The Hebrew title is, I guess it's called Yehoshua, meaning Yahweh saves. And if you've been keeping score, this is the first time where the Hebrew title and our title kind of match. The Hebrew Bible is still consistent. Joshua is mentioned in the first verse of the book, so that's where they get their title from. And the Christian title also matches because the Septuagint, the Greek also matches if they're getting the name Joshua from as the title for the book. And also Jesus is the English derivative of the Greek transliteration of Yehoshua via Latin. So basically you have Joshua in Hebrew, which got translated into Greek, Jesus, via Latin, and then we get it back in English, and that's where we get Jesus. So they're both the same name. So in modern Greek and in some Eastern European languages, they don't really differentiate. So like in English, we differentiate Joshua as the kind of the Old Testament Greek Hebrew name, and Jesus as the Greek name. Some of these languages, they don't have that distinction. So they're basically the same names. So they refer to Joshua as Jesus, son of Nun, which we see in Joshua as he's referred to as Joshua, son of Nun. All right. So the scope of this book, so when the book starts, Moses is dead and leadership has been passed on to Joshua. And at this time, Joshua and Caleb are the only ones left from the Exodus generation. And it picks up right after Deuteronomy ends, around 1406 BC. Israel at this point is at the east of the Jordan River. They've already conquered some of the land to the east of the Jordan River, and I think 2.5 tribes laid claim to that land, but they promised that they're still going to go with the rest of their brothers to conquer the rest of the land. So when Joshua starts, they're going to cross the Jordan, and they're going to have 3 big military campaigns. First in central Canaan, and then they're going to go down south, and then go up north, and basically conquer all of Canaan. And then the land will be divided among the tribes. And at the end, Joshua is going to echo what Moses did in urging people to keep the law. All right, so the book is divided into 4 sections. First is entering into the promised land, and then the military campaigns. And then after the military campaign's done, they divide the land. And then finally, Joshua's farewell and conclusion. All right, so in terms of the key themes, there are 4 themes. The author of Joshua clarified God's perspective on Israel's conquest of Canaan. And then the author emphasized the character of Israel's God in light of the conquest. And then the author stressed the need to know and heed God's expectations for his people. And finally, the author defined Israel's relationship to the promised land. All right, so we'll start from the first theme. All right, so the first theme is the author of Joshua clarified God's perspective on Israel's conquest of Canaan. All right, so the book is picking up directly after the death of Moses, which we read about in the very first verse. And the account seamlessly continues the national history recorded in the Pentateuch and serves as a bridge to the record of Israel's subsequent extended tenure in the Promised Land. So up until now, God's been preparing his people for entering the Promised Land. And then the book of Joshua is the bridge where we see the record of how they actually captured the Promised Land. And then the rest of the historical books, they record how they lived in their time in the Promised Land up until when the exile. So this book, it affirms Joshua as Moses' successor. And then it views the conquest. Actually, let's read that verse. Verse 1-2. 1-2 says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to you, to the people of Israel. So God himself is talking to Joshua, and he's affirming that he's going to take Moses' land and he's going to lead his people into the promised land. And then the book views the conquest as a fulfillment of the divine promises given to the patriarchs. I'll read verse 6, and if someone can look up the Genesis 15:18. All right, so verse 6 says, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them.
And then Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.
Mm-hmm. So what God promised to Abraham, I think by this time it would have been like 400 to 500 years ago. God is saying it's going to be fulfilled now. And then finally, the book also portrays the conquest as a turn away from the rebellion and punishment in the wilderness to a renewed covenant commitment to Yahweh. And there are those two big sections there. I think one of them is when the people are asked to be circumcised again as a sign of their renewed covenant. So Joshua is basically in contrast to what we saw in Numbers, where they were rebelling and they were getting punished. And the contrast here is that the rebellion's very, it's few. For most of the book, they are obeying what God asked them to do. And that's how they end up with the victories. The book also stresses the foundational place of the book of the law of Moses for Israel's future success and their existence. So continuing in chapter 1, after verse 6, it says, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. So God is basically tying their military success and everything that's going on in this book with how they are keeping the book of the law and how it's the foundational place. And also, if you go to the very end of the book in 23, 6. So by this time, they've conquered the land, they've divided it, and this is Joshua kind of giving his charge to whoever's taking over after him. And Joshua says, therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. I'm turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left. So you see how he's basically echoing what God gave him in the beginning, and he's passing that along to the future leaders. So their future success and existence depends on how how they keep the book of the law as a central foundational place. All right, so after centuries of sojourning, first in Canaan, and then in Egypt, and then enduring slavery and surviving 40 years in the wilderness, the nation could finally settle in their own homeland. And now that where they settle, they could cease from war. If anyone has 11:23, let's read that.
I have it.
Go
So
ahead, Sheila.
Joshua, I'm echoing. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war.
Mhm. So the key there is it's saying the land had rest from war. And so that theme of rest, it's actually picked up in various places in the rest of the Bible. So Hebrews portrays this rest in Joshua as an early picture of the Sabbath rest that believers enjoy through faith in Jesus. So it's basically, we've heard of the kind of the kingdom of God referred to as the now and not yet kingdom. So now as believers, we experience our like fellowship with each other, and we are part of this invisible spiritual kingdom that Jesus is building. And so that is the idea of the land being rest in Joshua. Hebrews ties back to believers, saying that that was an early picture for us. But it's also ultimately pointing to the ultimate rest that's yet to come. If we have Revelation 14:13.
Revelation 14:13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them.
Mm-hmm. So again, the word rest. The idea of after the conquering in Joshua, it says the land had rest. And as believers now, we get an early picture of that rest. And ultimately, Joshua is pointing to the ultimate rest that we will all have in the new heavens and new earth. All right, so for Christians reading Joshua, we should view every victory God secured and every claim of land Israel enjoyed as a reminder of God's faithfulness and as a pointer to the great victory won by Jesus over the enemies of sin and death, which secured us a lasting inheritance. So when we're reading Joshua, it's not that we need to go find people that we can fight wars against, but it's pointing us to how Jesus has already fought the battle for us, and we get to take part of this inheritance. So out of those three, if someone has 1 Peter 1:3-4.
Okay.
Sorry.
You want to go, Nick?
Yeah, I'll go. 1 Peter 1:3-4, or what was it, Deepak?
Yeah, 1:3-4.
Okay. Let's see. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is unperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you.
Mm-hmm. So because of Jesus's death and resurrection, we have this inheritance, and basically Joshua and the capture of the promised land is ultimately pointing to what is our real inheritance in heaven. All right, so that is the first theme from Joshua, how this is God's perspective on Israel's conquest. So this is not just, one nation going to war against another nation and they happen to win, but, this is God fulfilling his promises, and it's pointing to something much bigger than, just battles going on. All right, the second theme is the author of Joshua emphasized the character of Israel's God in light of the conquest. So the book of Joshua, it's showing God's character as we read through the narrative. So there are three aspects to God's character. The one who fought for Israel is faithful, he's sovereign, and he's holy. So first, God's faithful, his faithfulness to fulfill his covenant promises. So we already read that verse from Genesis 15:18. And I believe 17:18 is basically God making that same promise from Abraham. He's transferring the promise to Isaac. So by the time of the conquest, Abraham's descendants have been anticipating the promised land for approximately half a millennium. So they were waiting for a while in Canaan, and then they went down to Egypt, and eventually they were in bondage in Egypt, and then God rescued them, and then they were wandering the wilderness. So all of that added up is almost 500 years. That's how long they were waiting, but God is still faithful to fulfill his promises. So God remained trustworthy, and the conquest proved this fact. And Joshua 21:45, it says, not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. It all came to pass. So everything that God promised regarding the land, it came to pass. Even though, the people probably expected all of this to happen a lot sooner, but God worked it out in his timing. So God always accomplishes what he says he'll do. And even when Joseph, his dying wish was that they would take his bones with him. And then we see in Exodus that when they were leaving, Moses made sure that they took Joseph's bones. And we'll see in Joshua, I think it's towards the end, that they finally buried Joseph's bones there, just as he wanted. So that's also another example of God being faithful to his people. All right, and then the second character of God that we see in Joshua is that God's sovereign. God's sovereignty over nature and nations. So the Israel's faithful God was able to give Israel the land of Canaan because he owns the whole earth. And for that, can one of you get Exodus 19:5?
Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel.
Right. So God says all the earth is his. And we see also in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. And basically Joshua shows how God exercises control over the world and its processes. So some of the examples of how he does that is God blocks the Jordan River and he lets them enter Canaan. And this is when the Jordan River is at its fullest. It's actually flooding during this time. And the people they don't have any technology to, able to cross that at that point. But God shows that he's in control and he blocks the river so that they can go. And then later on, when they're fighting at Gibeon, he sends hail and he halts the sun. It describes as how the armies are battling and then God's sending heavy stones from heaven. And then when they're winning, Joshua asks God to basically, pause the day, and then the sun and the moon halt and they continue winning the battle. And then finally, in chapter 24, this is, I guess he's kind of giving a recap of everything that happened. And God says how, before they were going to these places, God sent his hornet ahead of them, and how he drove out these enemies using these hornets. And yeah, those are 3 examples of how God stepping in supernaturally to show that he's in control. And it's
Some hornet infestation.
Israel's sovereign God, he controlled both nature and nations, and he alone determined who would dwell in Canaan. And the people of Canaan, they were hearing of Yahweh's victories over Egypt and the Eastern kings. So by the time they go into the promised land, they're already afraid of them. And I believe the one in chapter 2 is Rahab talking. Yeah, let me see if I can get that. All right, this is Joshua 2, 9 to 11. All right, so this Rahab said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. And this is coming from a pagan woman. She did not experience any of this firsthand, while the people who are actually there who saw the plagues in Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea. They were unfaithful to God, but this person, she's giving testimony of all the wondrous things that God did, and she, and she actually believes all that.
Mhm.
And yeah, I guess that's why she's in the genealogy of Jesus.
Yeah.
All right, so because of God's sovereignty and how he's controlling nature to help them win all these battles, the people of Canaan, they are in fear. And then the next attribute is God's holiness and its demands. So God demonstrates his holiness to the Canaanites in judgment. The Canaanites were living in sin, and their sin had apparently reached full measure. And he used Israel to take their lives and their land. So let's go to Genesis 15, 16. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I'll start in verse 15. As for you, he's talking to Abraham, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Mhm. And then in Deuteronomy 9:5, it says, not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So because these people have been living in sin, and God actually, gave them ample time, and until it reached full measure, and now God is punishing them, and he's using Israelites as the instruments of his punishment to the Canaanites. And it's not just the Canaanites, but the Israelites also. They also received God's punishment. And we see that in chapter 7, where when the Israelites, when they did not meet God's standard, he punished them with defeat and death. So if anyone has that first verse from 7. Okay.
But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel.
Mhm. So God gave them specific instructions on how they should destroy all the things that are in Jericho, but Achan, he disobeys that, and God punishes not just him but also the people, and that's what in the rest of the chapter we see how there are different punishments for Achan and his family, and also the rest of the community. But the good news about Joshua is that incidents like this are pretty rare. Most of the time, the Israelites, they met God's standard, and he gave them victory after victory. All right, and the next character about God that we see in Joshua is that God is the warrior on behalf of his faithful people. Yahweh led Israel into Canaan, ready to give victory to his people if they would be faithful to him. So in one sense, God was going to give them the promised land no matter what, because he promised it to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his people. But in a different sense, he wants his people to be faithful. And as we saw in Deuteronomy, their success is tied to how faithful they are to the covenant. And so like we just read, Achan's theft and deception at Jericho, it was the exception and it was not the norm. And because Israel usually met God's standard of dependence, they benefited from his help. So because they usually obeyed what God asked them to, he fought as a warrior to give Israel victory over a superior foe. So we see in some of these battles where it talks about the number of people that they're going up against. They're always going up against bigger numbers. And there are people who actually live there, inside the cities, inside their fortresses and stuff. And so Israel was almost always the underdog in all of these battles, but God fights for them. He gives them an unusual strategy at Jericho. We know with the whole walking around and blowing the trumpets and making noise, which when you think about it, it's not very smart, but God uses that strategy to give them victory. And then there are specific instructions for victory at Ai. So this is the battle where Joshua splits the army in two, and there's a big group that's basically hiding out, and Joshua kind of leads one group to kind of basically drive the people, kind of try to draw out the people out of the city. And then once they're drawn out of the city, the other people who are in hiding, they go in there and basically take over the city without any of their warriors there. And then also in Gibeon, which we covered already, they get supernatural help where there's hailing from heaven, and that helps them win the battle there. So God is fighting on behalf of his people in terms of the instructions that he gives through Joshua, and also he's providing supernatural help through the elements. And we see this actually summarized in Acts 7:45, if someone can get there, how Israel succeeded because the Lord fought for Israel.
Acts 7:45, it says this, and having received in their turn are dispossessing the nations, whom God drove out before our fathers until the time of David.
All right, so it's God who drove them out, not their brilliant military strategy or the number of people that they had or the great warriors that they had, but it was God who's doing all the work. It was God who was fighting on behalf of his people, and the people's job was to obey him. All right, so that's the second theme of how we learned God's character through the conquest. All right, the next theme is the author of Joshua. He stressed the need to know and heed God's expectations for his people. So the author wrote not only to record the past, but also to teach his audience what they needed to do in the future to build on their earlier successes. So he's not just, writing down this record of this, this one time in Israel's history where, they were doing all the right things, but it was also to teach them that, if you do what God expects out of you, you will have success in the future too. And so there are two things that that Israel needed. Israel needed to be united, and Israel needed to be obedient. So Israel's need for unity. Israel succeeded when they acted in unison, but failed when they were divided. And we see the example of this in chapter 7. It's Achan's story again, where after that, after Achan's story, which is Jericho, the next battle is at Ai, where Joshua sends these men and he tells them to spy the land. And at the first battle, only part of the army, they go, without God's sanction, and they lose. And then later on, God gives them the strategy of how, they should take Ai with the whole, basically this, that's the one with the split army, I think. Yeah. So the whole army is engaged at that point, and their unity was essential for them to win that battle. So Israel had to be fully united for them to succeed. And then the next need is their need for obedience. So more than unity, Israel's success depended on their obedience, which God first tells Joshua back in the first chapter that they need to obey God and make the book of the law the central thing of their lives. Their ability to enter the land, maintain control, and enjoy it to the fullest depended on their obedience. When Israel failed to obey God's instruction or to ask for his direction, they lost a battle. And later on in chapter 9, we see that they lost a city. In general, as we've been talking about how, for the most part in this book, they did heed God's commands, regardless of how strange or difficult the orders appeared. So in chapter 3, when they're crossing the Jordan, basically it's the time of the year when the river is flooded, and God calls them to cross it, and they obey him, and they follow the instructions of sending the priests first, and then that's how they cross the river. And then in chapter 5, in Gilgal, they're in enemy territory, where the enemy can be upon them at any time, but God asks the men to circumcise themselves, and they do it, which leaves them vulnerable for a few days, and they still trust God, and they obeyed God at that time. And also the strategy at Jericho, where they're parading around and using their trumpets and voices instead of military weapons. So even when God gives them strange and difficult orders, they obey them, and that leads them to success. So God exalting humble obedience by the people and their leader ensured success. And it says as a summary that Joshua left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded. And so Joshua took all the land. And that's, that's great testimony to give someone that, he did everything that the Lord had commanded. All right, so the third theme was how, Israel needed to know and heed God's expectations for his people. And God had two expectations, that they had to be united and they had to be obedient. And that's true for us believers too, that, as the church, we need to be united and we need to obey God. All right. The final theme of the book is that the author of Joshua defined Israel's relationship to the promised land. So God delivered the land of Canaan to the Israelites, but also showed what they must do to take full advantage of this blessing. So what they had to do was Israel needed to obey God and stay faithful to the covenant he had made with them at Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai, essentially, it's going to define the rest of the Old Testament of how if they're faithful to the covenant, God's going to bless them, and they're not, the curses that he defined for them in Leviticus and Deuteronomy will be God's going to act that up on them. And Joshua warns them to do all that is written in the book of the law and not mix with the nations that are remaining. If they do, they'll perish from the land given to them. And we know if we look ahead that that's what they're going to end up doing, and they would be kicked out of the land by the time we get to the end of Kings, which would be the end of this section of former prophets. And like Israel, we are also called into fellowship with God, but we're under a different covenant. We're not promised land, but we can enjoy God's rest, which we talked about earlier from Hebrews, and we can have loving fellowship with the community of believers. If anyone has that, John chapter 13.
A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
Mhm. So that's the command that God is giving us, and God gave this something similar to Israel, where if when they're living in the promised land and if they follow God's law, then all the nations around them will also want to follow God's law. I'm just looking at how these people are following God and they're prosperous, and they'll cause everyone around them to also worship God. And now, for us under a different covenant, our loving fellowship with the community of believers will cause other people to also want to join that community. And ultimately, all of this is pointing us to how we'll enjoy dwelling with God face to face in the New Jerusalem. So that's our ultimate promised land that, one day that we'll all, as believers, we'll get to the new heaven and the new earth, and dwelling with God is what, that's what the ultimate promised land is. So what Joshua and the people were fighting for to get to the promised land is so that God will dwell in their midst, like he said in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And ultimately, that's pointing us for us all of God's people will dwell with them in the New Jerusalem. So Israel's relationship to the promised land, it's not just that they would have a place to live, but God was giving them this place so that they can, he can dwell among them, and they would honor God by following his covenant. And because of that, because of how faithful they are to that, that will be a witness to the nations among them. And now, we're also in a very similar situation where we don't have physical land, but we enjoy fellowship, and then all of this is eventually looking forward to the New Jerusalem. All right, so that is the last theme, and I guess we're super ahead of time today.
Yeah.
All right, so in summary, Joshua documents a rare period in Israel's history when the people actually listened to God and followed his leading. And God used his obedience to fulfill his covenant promises to Abraham, and he gave them the land where he will dwell among his people. All right, so any questions on Joshua or even the Deuteronomy?
Well, I don't have a question, but So, I mean, I know that it was almost a millennium by the time they got to the promised land. I never had it just sort of like expressed that way. So when I read that, it was like, wow, right? And then immediately, like just a minor pause, and he goes into that verse about all of God's promises being fulfilled. And it was like, God is never late, right? He's always on time and he always keeps his word. It was just like, when just the way that he wrote that in this book, it just kind of like really just smacked me right between the eyeballs, right? And then the other thing is that like they were in Egypt for 400 years, but that wasn't a discipline. It wasn't because they had been, unfaithful or disobedient. It was foretold, right? God told Abram they would be there for 400 years. And then they spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness for disobedience. It was just like, I don't know, those things just sort of were really juxtaposed at me as I was reading through this. It was just part of what jumped out.
Good stuff.
I actually did have a question that's not necessarily an easy one, although it's I'm definitely not meant as a trapping question or anything like that. When Achan is
Gabe's going off the reservation.
oh no, here we go. When
It would be a bumpy ride.
when Achan was killed, his entire family was killed with him. What is the point, I suppose? What is the purpose in the Old Testament context for taking out the entire family of an Israelite family, I suppose?
Well, I don't have a ready answer to your question. I don't know if there is. But just in general, questions regarding, take like for instance, and I don't know how much of this that we can turn around and apply to Achan's and his whole family. But remember, God had the Israelites destroy everyone in the land of Canaan, not just the soldiers, but everybody, man, woman, and child. And Pam and I were talking about this the other day, and she had been listening to a podcast, and the person was talking about how one of the things you see in fostering children is that when they come into your home, they bring with them the environment in which perceptions and actions and all of that they had in their previous environment, and how that can be the ill effects that can have on the whole family and the rest of the children and all that. Now, I don't know if that's if that has anything to do with why he destroyed not only Achan but his entire family. It may be that an awful lot of the family was in on the deception.
That was kind of what I was thinking, because he hid that stuff in the tent and nobody exposed it. No one called it out, right? And then
Yeah,
the other thing that comes to mind too is that verse that talks about the sins of the father being put onto the like the future generations up to the fourth generation. So it's like the sins of the father, on the family was something I was wondering about. But it's true that no one exposed what he had done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I think a little bit of that is just the kind of ancient, Eastern culture where it will definitely be more of a kind of a culture of shame, where it's not like when Achan's gone, the wife can just remarry and move on. What he did is going to follow that family, for a long time, and so it's almost like God's being merciful to them by so that they don't have to live the rest of their lives because of what he did.
So I guess to go off to what Gabe and Sheila were kind of hinting at, is that why, I don't know exactly where it is in the Bible, but is that why some people in the Bible were asking for forgiveness for their family and generations after them? I don't know if, I think, who was it? Was it David that did that? Or no, that was, I don't know who did that. Someone did that in the Old Testament. I'm not sure though.
Are you thinking of Daniel's prayer?
Yeah, Daniel's prayer. Okay. Yeah.
I think he's talking about kind of generational, like people praying
Because
about
Mike,
their.
because Mike, you hinted at like, like kids bringing in an environment that they were from, and so that like affecting the family that they were brought to.
Yes, so like if in the Canaanite wars, they spared the children, that meant the Israelites were going to have to adopt those children, right? They would need homes.
Yeah. Right. Huh.
And that may have nothing to do with with God taking Achan's family. Clearly, if you just killed all the adults that were involved in the deception, those kids would need to be taken in by somebody. And it may be like what Deepak said, God wanted to spare them the shame that would follow that.
Now, do you think that when entire nations are wiped out, every single person, do you think that it's because of the collective sin, or sort of how in Noah's time, how there was no one found righteous except for Noah and his family? Do you think that's the reason as well?
Explain the difference between collective sin and no one being found righteous.
Yeah, I suppose maybe for clarity's sake, that the reason people were wiped out, entire nations, were because there was not one person found righteous in the city. Sort of how when Abraham, I guess Abram at the time, I believe, is talking of
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes, Sodom and Gomorrah. Thank you. He says, what if there are 5 people who are righteous in the city? And he says, I will save it if there are 5. Do you think that means that in, say, Jericho, there was not one righteous person that was killed, I suppose?
I mean, I suppose that's possible. But when you talk about the children, I think it's more along the lines that if they didn't kill the children, that would leave an incredible number of children from not just pagan families, but grossly pagan families that would have to be, I mean, the religions that the Canaanites and all of them practice
were horrible. And while the Israelites were in Egypt, God allowed them to fill up the full measure of their sin in those pursuits. And so that would have been a lot of children for the Israelites to have adopted, and who were raised and are influenced by all of these gross pagan religions of their parents and forefathers. And so it may be more of that. I mean, and clearly, even children who don't have the ability, I'm talking about very young children who don't have the cognitive ability to know and depend upon and love Yahweh, just like very little children don't have the cognitive ability to understand who Jesus is and what he did at the cross and exercise faith in him. Even children that young aren't righteous. None are righteous. They're from conception. David says he was born in sin in Psalm 51:5, and he wasn't talking about the sin of his parents. He was talking about he was sinful from conception. And so from that standpoint, clearly there would have been no one righteous in the city. But I'm not, I don't know if that was the whole reason God had them wipe out everybody, man, woman, and child as well. It's like you said, it's a hard question, and it's hard for us emotionally and intellectually, it's like psychologically to try to think through that.
Which I think, Mike, probably why people who are unbelievers ask the question, like, well, I can never believe, when they use that argument, I can never believe in a God that, murdered, people, at that time. But it's like, I've asked the question where, well, how do you get the idea that murdering someone is wrong, but then you stop there and don't recognize that there is a holy God?
Right. And see, so, and they just the way they phrase the question shows their hand.
Yeah.
That God had them murder people.
Yeah.
So the way God phrased it is this, the way Deepak explained it earlier. God phrased it this way: all of the earth is mine. And the centuries of the way that the Canaanites and the other nations in that area lived, they filled that whole land with gross, evil, violent paganism, and they've defiled the land. And he told the Israelites, I'm not giving that land because of your righteousness, but I'm dispossessing this evil people of the land. I'm taking the land away from them because of their evil and giving it to you. So it wasn't murder, it was punishment. And remember that God punishes sin both in this life and in the life to come, because sin is deserving of eternal punishment. Because in sin, we offend an infinite God. So the offense is infinite. So the punishment for a sin is not related to the nature of the person committing it. The punishment for sin is related to the nature of the person who's been sinned against, the nature of the person who has been offended. So each and every one of our sins, even the ones that we consider the most petty and minor, are infinite offenses because they offend an infinite person. And that's why punishment for sin is eternal. And God punishes in this life and in the life to come. And that's not double jeopardy. That's not ganging up. That's just the nature of punishment being unending, eternal, because the offense, you can't pay an infinite debt of guilt. And you incur an infinite debt of guilt with one sin. And then you multiply that by many. So it's not murder when he tells the Israelites to kill everybody. Don't leave anybody alive. It's like Deepak said, him using Israel to carry out, to execute his judgment on the people. God did not leave it at the discretion of Israel. God did not leave it up to Israel's decision. God told Israel, I'm using you to dispossess this people because of their sin. I am not using you because of your righteousness or your greatness or anything like that. So I don't know if that clears that, if that helps. But as soon as they start calling it murder, what they've done is they've denied the fact that God owns the whole earth and everything in it and can do with it righteously what he sees fit. And that what he did in the land of Canaan was righteous punishment on his part. Just like later at Deepak is saying 2 Kings ends with the exile, he made it very clear he's using the Babylonians to punish his people, Israel, because of their disobedience. He made that very clear.
And like today, it's funny how you're saying like punishment and whatnot about, like, you know, punishment from God. Like today, I was listening to Albert Mohler, and he was talking about the shootings that were going on, and he mentioned, I guess, I don't know who said it, but I think it was the district attorney. He said something about the shooter, and he said yes, he will be charged to the fullest extent, and he will be
Of the law,
punished.
yeah.
The fullest extent of law.
I heard that,
And,
yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting. I was like, well, I mean,
Go ahead and finish the point because I'm not sure that others heard that.
Oh, well, I was saying that like Albert Mohler this morning, he was talking about how someone, I don't know, I think it was an attorney general or somebody, was saying that this shooter was going to suffer the full measure of the law, and he was going to, just get the full measure of everything. And then Albert Mohler mentions like that's impossible, because human standards, that can't be fulfilled, so because like you said, Mike, just one sin, is just damnation,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so Mohler's point was there's no way in a world an investigation can uncover the full extent of the sin.
yeah,
Or the whole judicial system can't address the full extent of the sin and carry out the full extent of justice, even though we agree with what the attorney general or what that district attorney said, that yes, they're going to carry it out to the full extent of the law. He was just making the point that that's why God judges, that's impossible for humans to do. We do it as much to the fullest extent as we can, but none of it is ever to the fullest extent.
Well, it made me think of our limitations,
Yes.
God, it's like we can never, it's God as the earth is his. So,
Yep.
So this has taken me full circle back to Gabe's original question. Because it's hard to see how God executing judgment on Achan's entire family would be an act of mercy, because if they're lost for eternity, right? Or did it? I mean,
but
am I missing something?
well, no, that's true, but if they were never going to be believers, and they don't sin as much as they could. Evidently, there's going to be gradations of suffering in hell, right?
Right. So it still could be an act of mercy by preventing them from fulfilling the level of sin that they could fulfill if they were allowed to live. And God, of course, knows the heart, so he would know, what their heart condition was at the time, and what they were capable of in the future, right?
Right, and also, the children who were so young they didn't have the cognitive ability to know and believe in and love God, didn't have the cognitive ability to have a relationship with him. If it's true that children that die that young God just saves them, mercifully saves them.
Well, I was thinking that same thing about the children of all of the Canaanite tribes, right?
That's true too.
That would have been killing them rather than having them taken over by Jewish families, would have been more merciful, because they are going to take that generational thought and practice and mentality with them, and they could have grown up, never known the Lord, and done horrible atrocities.
Yeah, so it's incredibly difficult and complex subject, and Gabe knew it when he brought it up.
Sorry.
But it's a very
That's a
legitimate.
homeschooler for you.
Yes, but it's a very legitimate question. It's just very difficult for us to answer because we're not God. Those that don't believe in God, that don't have a relationship with him, you can see why it's easy for them not to trust his wisdom and character in that whole situation, in that whole transaction. And even us who have a relationship with him and trust him implicitly and all that, it's still difficult for us to get our minds around and all of that. That's so anyway, it's a good question. It's a legitimate question, excruciatingly difficult to answer.
I always think back to where is it? Job 40, when God says in verse 8, he says, "Will you really," talking to Job, "will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Or do you have an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? And it goes on to talk about his voice and all, but it's like, are you going to speak the mind of God? Are you his counselor?
Yes, yes, exactly. It's much better. It's much better for us to when we're at that point where we just can't see how what God told them to do is right, is just, and all of that. It is much better to suspect our own ability to understand than it is to suspect God's character.
Could you repeat that quote? I'm going to write it down.
Well, I'm sure it's been said before and in much better ways. But when we reach that point where we just can't understand why God would do this, and it just doesn't strike us as right, it is much better for us to suspicion our own abilities to think through these things than it is to suspicion God's actions and characters.
Thank you.
That
Yeah.
was in the book. That was in what book was that in?
I don't know. It's in the
I
book
think-
of deeds now.
No,
Because I
Well,
did
that's what God tells us,
no,
right?
I
His-
think
his-
it was,
What did you say,
heard-
Sheila?
I said that's what God tells us, is that his ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are far above our thoughts. So who can know the mind of God, right? I mean,
That's right. Isaiah 55. And then
there you go.
also,
I'm terrible with my GPS.
and also Romans 9,
Yes.
11, 33 through 36 also.
Who's known the mind of the Lord and who has become his counselor.
Yes. We need to be very quick to suspicion ourselves, our ability to understand these things, and very slow or resistant to suspicioning God.
All right, let's pause, pray, and I'll stop the recording, and then we can talk more if needed. So, Gabe, can you close us?
Yes, sir. Dear Lord, we thank you for bringing us together, to listen to your word, to hear your word spoken through every book of the Old Testament. Lord, I thank you how each book still points to you, Lord, whether it be the faithfulness of your people or the faithlessness of your people, Lord, whether it be the wonderful history of your creation or the falling away in the book of Judges where it says every man did what was right in his own eyes. It all points to you being sovereign and you being in control of everything. May we never forget that and cease questioning you, Lord, and learn to seek our own understanding before we question the Lord's perfect understanding. For who has known his mind, who has become his counselor, who has brought something against him or given him that he might be repaid, for from him and through him and to him are all things. Lord, I just pray that that would be on our minds and our hearts as we go throughout the rest of our day. May we seek to glorify you in everything that we say and do. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.